This is Brian from College by Brian, and I am very pleased to be joined today by Amelia Manning, who specializes in career and college admissions. And I've known Amelia for a very short amount of time, but someone that immediately strikes you as very personable and knows a lot about higher education, about students and student success specifically. So very thankful to have her here, and hope you're doing well, Amelia.
Thanks, Brian. Hope you're doing well too.
Thank you. And so I've interviewed one other professional in the at the high school level, and which is where you're currently located, and in terms of the education industry. And would you mind kind of telling us a little bit about what this title means practically? Like, what is it that you do? But I'd also be curious. A second part to this question would be, um, so for those listening, unless you're living under a rock, there's a global pandemic going on right now. But how has your role shifted, or what's changed in terms of COVID-19 for your role?
Yes. Yeah. So my role, and I know my title isn't necessarily typical for a lot of high schools around. So um, a lot of what I do has to relate to students who are looking to go to college, whether that be starting at a 2-year school, community college, or a 4-year school, or looking at that 2+2 option, and using a career focused lens in doing so. So always starting with what is the career goal, or what are some career goals that you have in mind right now, if you haven't nailed it down to one just yet, to work backwards with students and their families throughout the whole college exploration process, through the application process, and then, of course, financial aid, applying for scholarships. So everything getting students ready to kind of take that next step if they are looking at post-secondary education. The second part of your question, in terms of how my role has changed, I think, outside of the setting, right, in terms of not being able to necessarily meet face to face, my role has changed a little bit just because of the changes that our students have experienced at the same time. So, for our seniors who graduated in the spring, a lot of those deadlines for their decisions were pushed back. So a little bit more conversation, whereas maybe we were talking about those decisions as early as March, and students were anticipating to be able to make their decisions by May 1st, really reevaluating the return on investment of their options, digging a little bit deeper. Some students, that I worked with were instead now looking at options that were closer to home. So in a way, I would say that it shifted a little bit in terms of questioning some steps that maybe had already been taken, which,
Hmm.
I think is important to do a gut check throughout the process. So I'm grateful that many institutions had the grace and the flexibility to allow students to be able to do that. So
Hmm.
really kind of being able to pivot with students, that's how it's changed for the most part. I would say, as our rising seniors now are looking at starting this whole process, coming up with different ways to engage with schools, finding other opportunities for students to engage with college admission counselors, has also been a bit of a shift that's started, and I'm sure is going to continue.
Oh yeah, as far as the college admissions process and that timeline, and also, whenever you're looking at a number of different institutions, they all might have different deadlines or different things that they're trying to tackle, and then in terms of a crisis, trying to communicate that effectively to students, and then so a professional I talked to recently in like mental health kind of profession, a lot of the topics were centered on like how to help students or walk with them through this heightened level of anxiety, and even, if it's a return to campus, and or just kind of navigating with so many unknowns. And but really interesting, though, also the career lens, as you called it, as far as your role. And I know that's just critically important right now, and subjects that I've heard, both at the community college level, but also at the 4-year level, is for students that are going into college. Why do they do that? And it's to get a job, right? But so it's this natural kind of fit of, if you're specializing on something, it's like, well, very happy that there's someone like you that is kind of bringing those things together, as far as that kind of advice and expertise is so important. So
Yeah, and you said something just now, Brian, that I want to underscore. You go to college to get a job. Any type of training or education after high school, the end goal is to get a job. I think sometimes, because we spend so much time, talking about what do you need to do to get to the next step after high school, sometimes
yeah.
that next step after the next step isn't talked about as much. And it really is thinking about that end goal of what's that career and what's that first job going to look like is so important.
Oh yeah, yeah. And thinking back to my own time, like I was a student that did not take advantage of the resources around him in college, and I changed majors 3 times, and I did not have a clue, as far as from a career standpoint or a job standpoint. It was just trying to kind of work through the process, and but that was very confusing.
Well, yeah, and I mean, that's perfectly normal and can happen. I think it's, making sure that you're being intentional as you're exploring those things
Yeah.
is what's most helpful.
Intentional exploration. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's yeah. No, I like that. As far as college planning, though, I'd be curious. In you've touched on this a little bit, as far as kind of marrying that to the career exploration too. But what is some of your general advice in terms of, well, planning for college? And and especially thinking about those students that might be rising seniors at this point, even.
Yeah, I feel like the pandemic has made many things uncertain. So I think for me, it's really more about what is it that you can control right now and what are the steps that you can be taking. Like many of those are still in place, especially for our rising seniors. I know the cancellation of standardized tests back in the spring makes it seem like there aren't that many things that can be done right now, but there still are quite a number of things students can be doing, especially over the summer, being able to research schools, come up with that list, and even start to narrow it down if possible. There are so many great, and I'm sure you've seen as well, so many great virtual opportunities to engage with schools now. I think of it as, doing your research and then going deeper into those opportunities. Any current student panels, extremely helpful. And of course, talking to admissions counselors makes such a difference too.
Yeah.
When you get that personal conversation, it can really help you go deeper into specific questions that you have. So I think as it relates to college exploration, those are all steps that students can still be taking now, still be gearing up for the fall and that application season. There are still things students can be doing.
Oh yeah, yeah. I feel like in talking with different 4-year college admissions folks, is with, without a doubt, when I asked them, as far as what should students be doing, and they say the number one thing was ask questions, and don't be afraid to ask questions. And in a lot of cases, I don't know if students always know what questions to ask, but just not to be afraid to reach out is such a critical piece in that process, for sure.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny that now that we can't necessarily be in person as much as usual. I think even reaching out, being on the receiving end of someone reaching out, it becomes all the more of a pleasure to talk to somebody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I have no doubt that, students will do their best to be as polite and thoughtful as possible, but it really does make a difference to have more opportunities for personal connection, and college admission counselors are so helpful. So that's
Oh yeah.
definitely something I recommend. And, even starting to think further down the road, starting those essays, now is a great time to do that.
Yeah.
Cataloging all your activities, these are steps that you can do now to kind of lay that foundation to really go run with in the fall.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, when we think about the college search process, money is always going to be top of mind for so many students for good reason. And if it's not, I feel like, well, it should be probably. And I'd be interested to hear, similar as far as, okay, your advice in terms of college planning, but what's your advice as far as those students that are kind of working through this process of, narrowing down their colleges, but also like submitting their FAFSA, like what would be some general like financial aid type resources or questions or things that you would advise for students at this point?
Yeah. So a few things. First I would say try to think of the colleges that you might be looking at as an investment situation, so that when you're looking at how much a school costs, you're thinking about that return on investment first and foremost, because it is a lot of money, especially right at the beginning. But the goal is that over time, it will pay dividends and then some. So be sure when you're building out that college list, we always talk about academic fit and social fit, but that financial fit piece is important too. And I also like to think of it in the way that we think of, the range of schools that you apply to, having the probable school, the match school, and the reach school. Think of that from a financial lens as well.
Mhm.
You might not find the most detailed and personalized information on a college website about cost of attendance. So if you allow yourself the opportunity to apply to a range of those schools, then that helps you further down the road. The goal is, I always tell my students, the goal is for you to have multiple options to choose from, so that at the end of the day, you have your pro and cons lists, and you get your financial aid offers back in the spring, right? So that's not even coming right at the very beginning of this process. And you can make a judgment call and weigh the various factors in addition to the cost to see what might be right for you. And the return on
Mm.
investment piece comes in when you think about your long-term career goal and what is required to get there. Do you need to go to graduate school? In which case, maybe it makes sense to think about the longer term education required to get there, and how much money that is going to cost, and how you're going to invest your money accordingly.
Mhm.
Are you looking at a high growing field, a high paying field? These are all different questions to take into consideration, because ultimately, if you're taking out student loans, the goal is for you to not be so overwhelmed by them that it becomes very difficult for you to have, a good lifestyle. And also the goal is for you to not be so overwhelmed by them while you're in college to where you're not able to finish. So there are a couple of good tools out there, and I can share them with you, Brian, too, that I like to use to help think about return on investment. One of them is from Junior Achievement, and you can kind of pick a career, and they will give you some loose information about the cost of school and even what student loans might look like. So that kind of helps take the idea of a student loan and, oh my goodness, thousands of dollars. What does that actually look like for me on a monthly basis? And then there's a great tool that I'm sure you've seen called Reality Check. That's from the Illinois Career Information System that
Mhm.
also helps to break down, monthly costs to help put that into perspective. Keep in mind, this is a long-term process. I'm sure, I know I see you giggling, Brian, but I'm
Yeah.
thinking of my first job I had out of college, and, you know, that was hard. It was not
Yeah.
easy, but it takes time. This is not a one-stop shop, if you will.
Oh yeah, and I also giggle because I'm still I'm still paying off student loans, and
Right.
but it goes back to that point that you made earlier, which is so perfect, was looking at it as an investment, and that makes me think back to this one interview that I heard, and this was from one of kind of the chief economists in higher education, and this was a few years ago, but he still mentioned this is expensive, and he was coming from one of the most expensive schools in the country, as a president for that school, and he said, but this is still the best investment that you can make, from a financial standpoint. But how can you enter into that in a way that's not going to just cripple you from the right after graduation? And but also it when I've talked to students before that are looking at, I ask them oh, what schools, how many schools are you thinking about applying to? And you're like, well, I would apply to these, but I'm just going to apply to this one because this is the cheaper option. And I say, well, how do you really know? And because the other thing you mentioned, as far as the work that goes into trying to calculate those costs, which I love that you brought up, is that um, I've talked about financial aid as it was confusing, for me going through college. It is confusing, and it's going to continue to be confusing, from a transparency standpoint, as far as what does it actually look like from a financial piece to actually go to this, that, or that school. But you don't know unless you actually take those steps to find out. And which you named some great resources there too. So, yeah.
Yeah, and what the quote you kind of mentioned, it reminds me of a different interview that I was reading through, and the person said basically, just because you can pay more for something doesn't necessarily mean that you should.
Yeah.
And I use that as a guiding principle a lot because it's important to put this all into perspective. And again, think of that career and what the projected salary looks like, what the job openings and the job growth looks like, um, because that can really change, the way that cost might look for you. And
Hmm.
and two, you also in applying to that range of schools, you might, to your point with the other example, Brian, you might find out that a school that you thought was going to be so expensive for you and out of the picture actually ends up becoming more reasonable. So it's important to really dive in and, if you're able to take a closer look at what scholarships you might be eligible for, or even some of the money that you may be able to get by filling out the FAFSA or the alternative application for Illinois financial aid,
Hmm.
that can make a huge difference. And you don't want to write anything off right away.
That's so well said. And yeah, and I'll make sure all those that you mentioned, and as far as resources and the alternative application, I didn't even bring up, that was perfect. And I'll include these in the description for this video. But um, you are always such a delight to connect with and talk to, and are such a professional and have a great grasp of what's out there to help students. So thank you for your time and doing this, but also for your commitment to students. And yeah, you do a lot of good things. So yeah, so thank you, Amelia, for your time today.
Well, thank you, Brian. And same goes to you. Thanks for all that you're doing to help students.